By the 5th century, the safety of the Roman world was tearing apart. Invading groups were sweeping across the European continent. As these armies attacked cities and severed reliable trade routes, people living in northeastern Italy suddenly found themselves scrambling to survive. These citizens faced a brutal reality. They had no vast armies to protect them. They had no mountain fortresses to hide behind. Remaining on solid ground meant facing military forces they simply could not fight, so they fled to the water. Specifically, they retreated into a sprawling network of shallow, muddy tidal flats along the Adriatic coast. The only way to guarantee their safety was to choose a location so difficult to navigate that a marching army wouldn't even attempt to follow them. Swamps happened to be an excellent military deterrent. Heavy medieval infantry and siege equipment require solid earth, not miles of shifting knee-deep saltwater. But that defensive isolation came with a severe cost. These early refugees had no farmland to grow crops, tightly limited access to fresh drinking water, and lived under the constant threat of the tides washing away their shelters. Sitting in that mud, watching a scattered collection of makeshift fishing huts struggle against the elements, it would have been impossible to predict that this exact spot would eventually become the wealthiest commercial center in medieval Europe. Because they arrived with zero natural resources to extract from the land, the early Venetians had to discard traditional survival strategies entirely. They stopped trying to master the earth and built a society designed to live entirely on the water. To build anything permanent, let alone heavy stone architecture, they first had to solve the physical reality of the lagoon. Soft clay cannot support the weight of a city. Their solution was grueling. They took massive timber logs and drove them straight down through the water, hammering thousands upon thousands of them deep into the submerged earth. Down in that oxygen-poor mud, the wood didn't rot, it petrified, turning into a rock-hard foundation that still holds up the entire city today. Driving millions of these piles by hand forced the community to adapt. They stopped hiding from the water and actively learned how to engineer around it. The sheer physical difficulty of surviving the lagoon forged the Venetians into highly disciplined problem solvers, perfectly equipping them to master life at sea. Once their homes were anchored, they realized their isolated swamp possessed one massive hidden advantage. It sat exactly in the middle of everything. This map shows medieval trade flowing from the resource-rich Eastern empires to the hungry markets of Western Europe. These routes passed directly by the lagoon. Venice weaponized this choke point. Controlling where distant regions exchange goods allows you to extract wealth without producing raw materials. While foreign aristocrats across the continent obsessed over capturing farmland and protecting royal bloodlines, Venice built a culture that actively revered merchants, contracts, and negotiation. They realized they didn't need to mine gold or grow wheat. They only needed to successfully take a profitable cut of every transaction passing through their waters. Operating as a global middleman requires massive logistical support. Specifically, it demands thousands of fast, highly reliable ships. To meet that demand, they built the Venetian arsenal, seen here in this historic photograph. This enclosed shipyard operated with an industrial efficiency that was centuries ahead of its time. Workers inside specialized in specific tasks, moving materials continuously down the line. They could assemble, rig, and launch a commercial vessel at a speed that left foreign visitors baffled. But a merchant fleet requires a stable government to protect it. While Venice had a chief leader called the Doge, who operated from this palace, his power was constrained by a complex web of voting councils designed to prevent any single individual from seizing total control. This convoluted bureaucracy and the relentless output of the arsenal shared the exact same purpose. They were both mechanisms born of calculated paranoia, built to ensure the strict predictability that international trade demands. The profits from that predictable stability poured into the lagoon. Ships arrived constantly, unloading spices, silks, perfumes, and precious stones onto the docks. The skyline changed as the early fishing huts were replaced by the extravagant multi-story palazzos you see here, lining the deep canals. At its height, the density of wealth was overwhelming. The markets buzzed with dozens of languages. and sunlight reflected off towering brick bell towers and enormous public basilicas like San Marco. The markets buzzed with dozens of languages, and sunlight reflected off towering brick bell towers and enormous public basilicas like San Marco. A lone merchant ship, weighted down with heavy cargo, pulls through the dense fog of the Venetian Lagoon. This was a power that didn't rely on the traditional medieval pillars of knights, castles, or vast tracts of land. This environment offered nothing to its inhabitants. The lagoon possessed no fertile soil for crops, no mineral resources to mine, and no geography capable of supporting a standing army. Yet this isolated settlement of refugees managed to bypass the limitations of its geography to become the most influential force in the Mediterranean. While neighboring kingdoms focused on territory and religious law, Venice became obsessed with a single dangerous metric: risk. Every voyage was a gamble. A single violent storm or a pirate raid could instantly bankrupt a wealthy individual, erasing years of accumulated capital in a single afternoon. To counter this, Venetians began pooling resources. Instead of one person funding a single ship, multiple investors bought shares in the same expedition. When a ship was lost, the financial damage was shared equally. This prevented any single disaster from resulting in total ruin. This model allowed the city to fund massive expeditions that were far beyond the reach of any individual merchant, providing the capital necessary for large-scale maritime trade. By making commerce safer and more predictable, the city created a unified financial syndicate that operated with a level of efficiency rarely seen in the medieval world. By the 11th century, demand for Eastern goods was surging across Europe. People who would never see the East were suddenly willing to pay a premium for its silk and spices. Venice positioned itself as the essential middleman. By maintaining a complex relationship with the Byzantine Empire, they secured commercial privileges and tax exemptions that gave them a permanent edge over their competitors. When the First Crusade began in 1096, the city's merchants didn't see a clash of faiths, they saw an explosion of economic opportunity. As Crusader states emerged, Venice moved in to supply them. They established a permanent presence in every major port, building a network of warehouses and trading posts throughout the region. While much of Europe was focused on the spiritual costs of the war, Venice was focused on the logistics, calculating shipping rates and securing supply contracts. In 1202, a new crusade required a fleet of unprecedented size. The Crusaders needed transport for thousands of men, and Venice was the only city capable of building it. The project was led by Doge Enrico Dandolo. Despite his age and partial blindness, he was a relentless executive who committed the city's entire industrial capacity to the contract. Every resource was diverted to the shipyards. The city worked on an industrial scale to construct a massive fleet, anticipating a payday that would cement their wealth for generations. But when the Crusaders arrived, they were unable to pay. After months of preparation and massive expense, Venice's customers were short on funds. Venice refused to accept the loss. Since the debt couldn't be paid in gold, it would be paid in service, leading to a dark renegotiation of the entire crusade. Dandolo and the Venetians began to systematically redirect the army. The Crusade's original destination was abandoned, as the Holy War was turned toward the city's political enemies. A series of schemes led the Crusader fleet to the gates of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and Venice's former ally and greatest commercial rival. In 1204, the Crusaders attacked. The Christian capital of the East was besieged and violently conquered by the very army meant to protect it. Venice emerged as the primary beneficiary. They seized commercial territories, plundered the city's treasures, and took direct control of the most important trade routes in the Mediterranean. By leveraging a defaulted debt, Venice had successfully turned a religious war into a total monopoly over the empire's former trade network. This sudden influx of wealth triggered immediate conflict. Venice entered a period of naval warfare with Genoa, its main maritime rival, as both cities fought for control of the new markets. Despite these tensions, the Venetian system remained stable. Power was consolidated within a small circle of elite merchant dynasties who treated the state's survival as a business necessity. The volume of gold flowing from these new territories began to rewrite the city's landscape. Simple structures were replaced by elaborate stone palaces and churches, decorated with plundered treasure, reflecting the compounding profits of the city's merchant class. By the 13th century, Venice sat at the center of a global system. Goods from Asia and the Middle East moved through their ports before being distributed to the rest of Europe. Their power endured because they recognized a fundamental truth. While kings and religious fervor are fleeting, the world is run by those who control the logistics of trade. The city remains an image of that legacy, wealthy, stable, and floating calmly on the water, forever built on the foundation of a calculated risk. The Venetian Lagoon at dawn is an isolated stretch of still water and thick mist. There are no fertile fields here, no sprawling forests, no natural deposits of iron or gold. By the late 13th century, this cluster of islands had accumulated more liquid capital than most mainland kingdoms. Merchants routinely calculated their gains before breakfast. The city had embedded itself into the mechanics of international commerce. If silk or spices moved between Asia and Europe, a Venetian was almost certainly involved somewhere along the route. They owned the ships, they financed the dangerous months-long voyages, they controlled the massive coastal warehouses. And if they did none of those things, they found a way to charge a fee for the paperwork. The challenge was how a fiercely independent city, literally floating on salt water, managed to hold its ground and accumulate vast capital during an era that routinely swallowed massive land-based empires. The answer lay in strict calculation. Lacking the numbers for a massive standing army or endless territory, they perfected the art of the middleman, turning geographic vulnerability into a relentless commercial advantage. The true source of this wealth originated thousands of miles to the east. Around 1271, a young Venetian named Marco Polo ventured far beyond the familiar Mediterranean borders. Reaching the court of the Mongol Empire, he encountered an administrative and commercial system of a scale practically incomprehensible to medieval Italians. Massive, interconnected trade routes stretched across entire continents. Moving heavily along these arteries were highly prized goods, bulk shipments of pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. Every step of that distance added value. Each time a cargo traversed a mountain range, crossed a desert, or changed hands at a border crossing, the final asking price multiplied. This diagram maps the supply chain stretching from Asia to Europe. Venice recognized that navigating the entirety of that journey was deeply inefficient. They positioned themselves exclusively at the final choke point. By capturing the very end of the line, right before the goods reached wealthy European buyers, they secured the highest profit margins while carrying a fraction of the geographic risk. A state does not need to own the origins of global resources to build an empire. It only needs to own the door those resources must pass through. Back in the claustrophobic, narrow stone streets of the lagoon, that influx of money began fracturing the society. Elite families amassed commercial fortunes that easily outpaced mainland kings. A distinct hierarchy solidified. This concentrated group of merchants steadily gained control over the shipyards, the heavy maritime warehouses, and ultimately the political levers of the city itself. In 1297, they codified this dominance through a legislative act known as the Serrata, or the Closing of the Great Council. It sounded like a mild administrative adjustment. In practice, it was an absolute restriction of access. Membership in the governing institutions was permanently locked to a specific list of established noble bloodlines. Future political influence would be strictly inherited. Faced with the potential for dynastic chaos, the leadership discarded broad democratic participation. They transformed the republic into a fortified aristocratic oligarchy designed to protect the commercial machine. That internal stability was tested repeatedly by external violence. For centuries, Venice was locked in a bitter maritime rivalry with Genoa. Massive fleets clashed across the Mediterranean. The resulting wars created severe market volatility and heavy financial losses. Yet, the Republic consistently absorbed the damage, rebuilding its ships and maintaining its commercial network. But in 1348, a drastically different kind of threat arrived at the docks. The maritime networks that had poured wealth into the lagoon now acted as a superhighway for the bubonic plague. This map of the Venetian Lagoon illustrates their response. The government implemented organized defensive measures, isolating vessels and separating the infected on scattered islands at the edge of the lagoon. Ships anchored for a mandatory 40-day isolation, a quarantana giorni, giving the world the word quarantine. The merchant elite recognized that protecting their ledgers required an equally rigorous protection of the public's health. The population suffered horrifying losses during the 14th century, yet the city endured. The markets reopened, and shipping logs filled back up with international contracts. Whether it was sudden economic collapse, naval wars, or pandemics, the Republic consistently adapted its mechanics to survive. Their centuries of dominance proved that projecting power did not require vast domestic agriculture or millions of foot soldiers. It demanded geographical positioning and an almost mechanical resilience. Eventually, new oceanic routes around Africa would bypass the Mediterranean entirely, and massive rising states would challenge this finely tuned monopoly. But in its twilight, the city remained suspended between east and west, its leadership operating with certainty that their commercial dominance was a permanent fixture of the world. Venice stands as a monument to the lengths a society will go to protect its wealth, constructing an illusion of forever against history's dark tides. The 15th century arrived in Venice without ceremony. No trumpet sounded, and no messenger stood in St. Mark's Square to announce that the city had reached its highest point of influence. Most people living through this peak had absolutely no idea it was happening. They were consumed by taxes and shipments, engaged in the constant daily grind of maintaining a maritime empire. But that daily grind generated immense surplus, and eventually the wealth spilled over into stone. The city's elite engaged in a relentless real estate argument, competing to see who could import the most exotic marble or build the grandest arches. This spending was a byproduct of trade operating at peak efficiency. Venetian merchants dominated ports from Alexandria to Constantinople, linking European buyers to Eastern markets. The Republic had optimized its economy so thoroughly that massive fortunes were being accumulated without anyone ever needing to draw a sword. Well, usually. Even a merchant empire has to guard its cargo, and Venetian leaders knew that protecting their shipping lanes required a serious naval deterrent. The arsenal was the engine of that defense. It operated with staggering organization, assembling hulls, sails, and rope in one of the largest industrial complexes of the medieval world, a massive factory that floated. The political machinery running the city was equally rigid. Influence remained locked within a deeply entrenched aristocracy, circulating tightly among a select few elite families who ensured policies rarely shifted. This concentration of power provided a distinct economic advantage: predictability. Investors are much more willing to finance expensive maritime fleets when they are confident tomorrow's laws will look exactly like today's. Venice had engineered a stable, highly profitable system. But that same success bred a kind of blindness, masking the reality that the physical rules governing global trade were beginning to shift. Far to the east, the balance of power was fracturing. The remnants of the Byzantine Empire were weakening, while Ottoman rulers steadily expanded their territory, taking ground city by city. In 1453, Constantinople fell to Ottoman forces after a lengthy siege. Across Europe, the news was received as a catastrophe, an apocalyptic blow to the ancient world order. Venice reacted with strict pragmatism. Instead of retreating, their diplomats and merchants immediately began negotiating agreements to keep their commercial relationships intact with the victors. It was a simple calculation. You maintain wealth by doing business with your neighbors, even when those neighbors actively threaten your strategic interests. Through sheer adaptability, the Republic proved its economic machine could absorb massive geopolitical shocks and keep right on generating profit. But a completely different threat was developing far to the west, well outside the traditional boundaries of the Mediterranean economy. Portuguese navigators were mounting a series of methodical expeditions, pushing farther and farther down the unexplored coastline of Africa. This map shows the gradual progress of those voyages to bypass traditional choke points by finding a direct sea route to Asian markets. Eventually, they broke through. A Portuguese expedition finally rounded the southern tip and sailed directly east, connecting Europe to India by sea. Portuguese navigation attacked the underlying logic of the Venetian economy without ever firing a cannon. The Republic had locked its diplomatic focus on the east, unaware that its relevance was being eroded by sailors heading south. For centuries, Venice profited because of a simple geographic reality. The city served as the mandatory middleman between Eastern markets and Western buyers. This map illustrates the New World view. By opening an oceanic path to India, these routes turned the Mediterranean into a closed lake, bypassing Venice entirely. A merchant can negotiate a new treaty, but a city cannot physically relocate. Venice could not drag the Adriatic Sea closer to the Atlantic Ocean. The resulting decline took the form of a slow, undeniable bleeding of dominance as wealth drifted toward Atlantic ports. The specific geographic location that made the Venetian Empire possible had permanently locked it into a secondary role. Faced with the creeping obsolescence of their trade routes, the Venetian elite responded by accelerating their spending on art, architecture, and civic projects. The artistic explosion of the Venetian Renaissance functioned as a byproduct of supreme, lingering arrogance. As twilight falls across the lagoon today, the city still looks magnificent. The canals glow, the palaces project strength, and the surface appears invincible. Yet beneath that exterior was an empire that history had quietly outmaneuvered. No amount of wealth, stability, or pragmatism can protect a trading hub when the map of the world is redrawn entirely without them. For centuries, Venice managed to control the flow of global wealth from a city built on mud and water. Merchants, kings, and nobles across Europe relied on Venetian networks for Asian spices and Eastern silks. If a luxury good reached a Western market, it likely passed through these docks. Venice secured this trade monopoly through a carefully managed public performance of power, designed to convince the world that its system would never change. Every year, the Doge performed the marriage of the sea, casting a golden ring into the water to assert an eternal partnership between the Republic and the ocean. This orchestrated theater was as vital as their merchant fleets. It projected a reality of immortality, signaling to rivals that Venice remained the essential center of the world. Economic systems often appear stable at the precise moment they begin to fail. Beneath the singing choirs and the golden architecture of the 16th century, the foundations of the Venetian monopoly were fracturing. Global commerce was shifting its center of gravity, threatening to turn the busiest crossroads on Earth into a dead end. Decline starts quietly. A few ships choose a different route. A few merchants discover a cheaper supplier. In the late 1400s, Portuguese and Spanish explorers began opening the Atlantic Ocean, seeking a way to reach the east without crossing the Mediterranean. These explorers established new paths to India by sailing directly around Africa, bypassing Venetian middlemen entirely. Entire oceans that had existed at the edge of European awareness suddenly became the primary arteries of global commerce. Venice's warehouses remained active, but the city was no longer the world's essential crossroads. The Republic was trapped by the same geography that once made it rich, watching as the center of wealth moved westward. While trade routes shifted, a visible geopolitical threat emerged: the rapid expansion of the Ottoman Empire across the Mediterranean. The ensuing decades of repeated warfare drained the treasury of a republic that required commercial stability to survive. At the same time, Venice was fighting an internal battle against the geography of the lagoon. To prevent the city from sinking, generations of workers were required to drive thousands of heavy wooden piles into the mud, a continuous labor of maintenance hidden beneath the elegant palaces. Managing a multi-generational war on two fronts, one military and one environmental, consumed the funds Venice needed to adapt to the rising Atlantic powers. In 1571, Venice and its allies met the Ottoman fleet at the Battle of Lepanto, one of the largest naval clashes in history. Across Europe, the victory was celebrated with ringing bells and grand festivities, projecting an image of Venetian military supremacy. But the victory did not restore Venetian control over global trade. The economic reality remained unchanged. Paradoxically, as its geopolitical influence wavered, Venice funded its most brilliant artistic golden age, filling the city with masterpieces of light and color. For Venice, this peak of cultural beauty served as a way of preserving an empire that was beginning to slip away. By the 1600s, the physical facade of Venice remained perfectly intact, though its strategic foundations had eroded. Global wealth had moved to the Atlantic powers. The Dutch and English were now dictating the terms of world commerce. Merchants and craftsmen continued their daily routines, and families argued over money, largely unaware that the macroeconomic system supporting them was disappearing. This is the nature of historical decline. It is not always a sudden catastrophe, but a slow fading into irrelevance. To a visitor, the shimmering canals and reflecting palaces made Venice look as immortal as it did a century prior. But prestige and past success cannot stop the shifting tides of history. Venice remained a masterpiece of art and architecture, but it was now a monument to a bypassed era. The Venetian Republic existed for over 1,000 years, generations beyond counting. While entire kingdoms rose and vanished, languages evolved, and other empires appeared and disappeared, this city endured. The trouble with a golden age is that nobody realizes it is ending until much later. When you are standing right in the middle of one, everything still looks impressive. The buildings were magnificent, the markets were busy, the government passed laws and collected taxes just as it always had. To the merchants steering those boats, prosperity felt permanent. The Republic did not suddenly grow weak. Instead, the rest of the world was growing stronger. For centuries, Venice occupied the center of global trade, but history rewards movement. The Atlantic world expanded. The Dutch built a commercial empire, and the English developed a maritime network. Colonial wealth poured into new ports. Meanwhile, Venice remained where it always had been. The geography that originally protected the Republic and made it wealthy eventually stranded it. The rest of the world reorganized itself around different routes. Trade still flowed through the city, but the overwhelming dominance was gone. So the Republic adapted. It focused heavily on specialized industries and luxury goods. Venetian craftsmen remained famous throughout Europe, particularly the glassmakers of Murano. Creating a complex glass vessel required highly specialized, delicate skill. The government guarded these techniques with remarkable seriousness. Some craftsmen were effectively forbidden from leaving the Republic. Officials worried that competitors might learn their secrets, a strict system of international industrial espionage. And while trade patterns fractured, the city discovered another reliable source of prosperity. Wealthy travelers increasingly viewed Venice as a destination simply because it was Venice. Artists, writers, diplomats, and nobles arrived. The city actively fostered this, developing a reputation for elegance, entertainment, and sophistication to draw in foreign capital. Music and theater flourished. This reached its peak during Carnival, the season when masks appeared everywhere. They were beautiful objects, but they also served a psychological purpose. Anonymity allows people to behave differently, loosening the strict social rules of wealthy European elites. Venice transformed itself into one enormous theatrical performance. The perpetual celebrations and masks were a highly effective, calculated economic defense mechanism, a way to generate revenue and project prosperity as the empire faded. Yet beneath the music and celebration, the decline continued. It unfolded slowly across generations. A little less influence here, a little less revenue there, a few lost territories, and gradually diminishing resources. European politics now revolved around powers far larger than the Republic. Nations like France, Spain, and Austria fielded massive armies, while Venice's military capacity remained stagnant. By the late 18th century, revolutionary France and Napoleon Bonaparte began sweeping across the political landscape. Armies marched, borders shifted, and governments fell. In 1797, Napoleon turned his attention toward the lagoon. The ancient republic surrendered. Without dramatic final battles or heroic last stands, the institutions that had ruled for centuries simply came to an end. The event shocked Europe. It felt unnatural. The Republic had existed for so long that its disappearance was like discovering a mountain had vanished overnight. No amount of cultural prestige or historical endurance offered protection against modern warfare. The government was overwhelmed by forces larger than itself. After Napoleon, the Republic was finished. Fleets disbanded, control passed to the French, then the Austrians, and eventually Venice became part of a unified Italy. Many powers vanish entirely when their governments fall. Their monuments crumble to dust. But Venice refused to disappear. Its physical beauty and cultural spectacles remained perfectly intact. Trade no longer defined its importance. Instead, the city evolved into a pure monument. Millions of visitors eventually arrived simply to walk the narrow streets and witness the architecture of a vanished superpower. Today, the city faces a new existential crisis. Rising sea levels and environmental pressures force modern visitors to walk across raised platforms as water regularly breaches the historic squares. In a sense, the city is still fighting the exact same battle to survive against the sea that those original refugees started 15 centuries ago. The merchants are gone, the doges are gone, but as night settles over the lagoon, the water reflects lights from palaces older than entire nations. The empire is gone, yet Venice remains. Perhaps that is its greatest victory. Transforming from a military and commercial power, into an eternal idea that long outlived the republic that built it.